Hello. My name is Ronald Melnick. I was a senior toxicologist at the National Toxicology Program at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And while I was a member of the National Toxicology Program, I designed the study that was conducted by the NTP on cell phone radio frequency radiation. So when I saw the report that was just referred to from the FDA, I was concerned that this report misrepresents the utility of the NTP studies for assessing human health risk. So I read the report carefully. I made a number of comments, put these together, and wrote a letter to Jeffrey Shuren, who is the Center Director for Devices and Radiological Health. And in that letter, I noted that this was an anonymous report that misrepresented the NTP studies. So, for example, the NTP studies was peer-reviewed over a three-day session in 2018, and the peer review, which was an external peer review process, came to the conclusion that the NTP study provided clear evidence of carcinogenic activity. However, the FDA report says that the NTP study cannot be used to relate to humans for a number of reasons. And I found this quite strange, since it was the FDA that nominated cell phone radio frequency radiation to the NTP for studies in animals so that those data could be used to assess the risk to human health. So some of the issues, and I'll just hit on a couple of them at this time, are that the NTP study was designed very carefully to evaluate organ-specific dose. What was the level of exposure in particular organs within the animals when exposed to radio frequency radiation. The NTP studies used exposures, which are referred to as SARs, of 1.5, 3, and 6 watts per kilogram. And this is in the range of the exposure standard of the FCC, which is 1.6 watts per kilogram averaged over any 1 gram of tissue. Now, the FDA complains that this should have been a whole body exposure. Since we used a whole body exposure, we should have limited this to 0.08 watts per kilogram. If the study had been done that way, then the brain of animals would have been exposed to a level 20-fold less than that which is permissible by the FCC. So the issue is risk related to local tissue exposure versus whole body exposure. And in terms of understanding organ-specific risk, for example, such as at the brain, it's that local exposure when the cell phone and its antenna is held next to the head. The FDA also made a number of suggestions that the body temperature actually rose in the animals, and that was possibly the reason for the tumor response that was observed. However, the NTP study was conducted such that body temperatures would not rise more than 1 degree centigrade, which is the same basis for the FCC standard. There were no indications of tissue damage in the 28-day study. Body weights of animals in the 2-year study were comparable in exposed animals and controls. And there were no clinical signs indicating animals under any kind of stress or other effects. So I found that the criticisms raised by the FDA were just not valid to allow their casual dismissal of the NTP studies. And since the FDA, I believe, states their mission to be to promote and protect public health, I think the dismissal of the NTP studies, as well as mechanistic studies and epidemiology studies, is inconsistent with their stated mission. Thank you.
The NTP study was designed to test the assumption that underlies our FCC limits. Could you clarify that and summarize the importance in terms of FCC limits and how important it is that the FDA address that?
The underlying assumption at the time was that there could not be any type of adverse effect other than tissue heating. And the study was designed to test that assumption and provide multiple exposure levels so that a quantitative risk assessment could be conducted. The issue, though, between the whole body and the tissue, local tissue level, is a very simple concept, is that here I'm holding a pen. If this is an antenna, if I hold that next to my head, the exposure is in the region of my head. What is exposed is that local tissue level, not the whole body. If I divide that exposure by my body weight, I'm misrepresenting the exposure to the brain. So when the NTP study used what are called reverberation chambers, it was a whole body exposure, but we had accurate dosimetry of the various organs inside the body so that organ-specific risk could be determined. And that was the basis for the study, and the levels that were used were comparable to the FCC's value of 1.6. Now, one of the issues is that when you're considering risk, when in a study with 50 or 100 animals per group, we're trying to characterize whether or not there is an adverse effect. But when this information gets addressed to human risk in a large population, the risk of, say, 1 in 1,000, which is very high, cannot be determined when you have a group size of 50 to 100. So in that sense, we increased the number of hours per day, which was probably fortuitous because people hold their cell phones in their pockets or are exposed to Wi-Fi, cell phone radiation, more than just the number of hours that they are talking on a cell phone, or they keep it in a pocket and it's still communicating with the cell tower. So our interest was, what would be the level of exposure to a tissue as a function of effects that might be observed? And dosimetry is really two issues: the intensity and the duration of exposure. And that information can be derived from the NTP study and used to estimate risk and determine what is actually the risk level associated with the FCC limit of 1.6 watts per kilogram.
Thank you. And what do you think that the FDA should do?
Well, the FDA asked for the study so that health risks could be quantified. The data, they've had the data now for 2 years and haven't acted on it. If they acted on the NTP data, they could quantify the risks and provide that information to the FCC to look at the level of risk associated with the allowable exposures for the general population.
Could you please address the criticism that the NTP study is not valid because the control animals actually lived less long than the exposed animals?
Well, okay, this is a comment that keeps showing itself up in the media, although I've addressed it in a paper. There are two issues related to why this is not the case. One is, in the exposure group that had the highest level of tumor response, it was the 6 watt per kilogram group that had CDMA modulated radio frequency radiation exposure. In that group, there was no difference between the survival of that group and the sham control group. And secondly, there were observations of early lesions in the exposed groups that were not present in the sham groups. And these included schwannomas of the heart, which was one of the effects, and glial cell hyperplasia, which is considered a pre-neoplastic lesion or glioma. These effects were seen at 50 weeks, somewhere around 50 weeks and around 70 weeks in the NTP study. And therefore, the animals did live long enough to develop these type of lesions, but they were not observed in the sham controls.
All right.
So to me, that just invalidates that criticism, but it just goes on and on.
Well, the criticism is therefore not valid, but it keeps appearing in the media and in journalistic accounts that are incorrect in describing the NTP. I think let's turn now to Dr. Baldwin, who is a clinician, and I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Hillel Baldwin.
I've been practicing neurosurgery in Tucson, Arizona since 1992. I'm an active neurosurgeon with the Carondelet Neurological Institute that's part of St. Joe's Hospital here in Tucson. I come to this as an active clinician treating both malignant and benign brain tumors on a regular basis in my practice. And I am concerned and worried about the content and tone of the FDA study in the sense that it appears dismissive to me, and perhaps it doesn't serve the public in terms of the public health or their safety. In my daily practice, I'm seeing a growing population of ever younger cancer patients that, in my clinical judgment, more likely than not, have been caused by cell phone use. In our clinical practice, we don't have the luxury of telling people, in terms of advising them about radiofrequency radiation, we don't have the luxury of being able to tell them, well, let's just wait 5 years and we'll tell you about the study. We really have to practice on the precautionary principle of ways that we can prevent disease. That segues into the American Cancer Society published data that came out in the journal Cancer. It's a very well-known cancer journal that clinicians actively read on a regular basis, just like the JAMA. And they published in 2016 that brain cancer was the leading cause of death in men under age 40. And I'm seeing this phenomena on a regular basis. I'm seeing it as young as 28, 35 with grade 4 glioblastoma patients that are presenting to my emergency room with new onset seizures for the first time. And already these are devastating tumors. And yes, it may be anecdotal, but you go to interview and a lot of these are on the right side of the brain, where most of the people use cell phones, but they can even occur on the left side of the brain. But it's still more likely than not related. The other piece I wanted to emphasize is that I'm on a continuing quest to maintain my education in neurosurgery and remain active. I've been doing this since 1992 in clinical practice, and I go to national, international meetings with leading skull-based surgeons, tumor surgeons the world over that are so gifted that they can resect tumors at the base of the skull with a range of approaches, and now even minimally invasive techniques that are done through keyholes through the nose or through the base of the skull. But the sad piece of a lot of these presentations is that if they followed the patients long enough, literally in 2 to 5 years, we're seeing recurrences of these tumors with gifted neurosurgeons that are doing their best. And so this is a very frustrating phenomenon. I cannot help believe that the biology of central nervous system disease is affected by radiofrequency radiation. In medicine, in neurosurgery, in every specialty, no one publishes anything anonymously. We have to take credit and be accountable for position statements that we come out with. We have to be able to defend our data and defend our conclusions. And to me, the FDA study is highly dismissive. My other pieces is that I've read enough of the science, seen enough of the published data that when people walk into my office and I see their cell phones on their body, next to the head, talking, taking messages, and I even have signs in my office that request, please turn off your cell phone. A lot of my older people don't know how to even use their phones. But I know enough from my clinical experience that cell phone radiation is harmful, and my advice to them is keep the phone off the body at all times. The most recent study from Yale University, also sponsored by the American Cancer Society, identified a fairly common genetic alteration that increases the risk of developing thyroid cancer. That was in response to cell phone use. So there's a direct correlation. The phone is next to the neck, it's next to the head. Salivary gland tumors have also been reported in clinical studies. So at the end of the day, there may be variations in how disease manifests. And we know enough that internationally, people are told in France, Switzerland, and Israel by medical authorities to keep cell phones off their body. Keeping wireless devices, especially away from children, off your body and away from your head is a very good maxim. And so my opinion is that it's just common sense that we practice this precautionary principle.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your remarks, and I think your comment about that you can't tell people, wait 5 years and I'll tell you what to do, is exactly the dilemma that we face. I'm Dr. Deborah Davis. I'm the president of Environmental Health Trust. I'm a fellow in the American College of Epidemiology, and I'm also a toxicologist who formerly served on the scientific advisory board for the National Toxicology Program, as well as other programs in the government for the CDC and the World Health Organization. I should add that Environmental Health Trust is calling for a retraction of the FDA report that it purports to be a literature review and says there is a scientific consensus that cell phone radiation is safe. We do not agree. And the reasons we do not agree are outlined in documents that you can find on our website. But as Dr. Melnick pointed out, animal research is the cornerstone for developing public health policy. When we develop drugs, we test them in animals in order to predict effects in humans and figure out how to prevent harmful effects and promote beneficial effects. That's the foundation of animal testing for the FDA. It makes no sense for the FDA now to say that the animal study that they originally called for, that they originally designed, that they originally approved the protocol for exposure, is now not valid in estimating human effects. Here's what we know. Every compound that we know for certain causes cancer in people, because we have enough accumulated information, will also cause cancer in animals when adequately tested. Well, that is why we test animals, not to prove that there's harm in humans, but to prevent it. As Dr. Baldwin just said, we seek to prevent harm. We seek precaution. That's the foundation of animal testing. This report would never merit publication in a scientific journal. It is anonymous. It has not gone through any review, and it's a very selective and, in my opinion, distorted identification of the literature. The rejection that it makes of the National Toxicology Program, as Dr. Melnick has just told us, is without merit. It does not understand the most basic concepts of toxicology testing. One example that he gave, in an animal study with 50 animals, you are able to detect a risk if it's 1 in 50. Brain cancers occur in the human population at a rate of about 7 per 100,000. In order to study enough animals to detect that kind of risk, normally you would need to study thousands of animals. And in fact, when the Ramazzini Institute did exactly that and expanded the number of animals studied in different dose groups, they found that at levels of radiation much lower than the cell phone, there was the same highly malignant, very rare tumors that the National Toxicology Program found at levels of radiation that you can get today from 2G, 3G, and 4G phones. The study was actually of the older forms of radiation. That is why we are calling for the retraction of this report. It is anonymous. The references are highly skewed. It does not provide a comprehensive review of the literature, and it is a disservice to the American public. To ignore animal studies means we are treating people like lab rats in a study with no controls. Right now, there are hundreds of millions of children who are being exposed every day to cell phone radiation and wireless radiation in their schools and in their homes because of the failure of public health authorities to do a good enough job of explaining what we know now. In addition, ask yourself this: where is the US government in terms of supporting research in this field? Where are the training programs for physicians to understand more about bioelectromagnetics? There is a complete vacuum, a dark hole, when it comes to studies underway, monitoring or surveillance of effects. We have long said at Environmental Health Trust that if cell phones were drugs, they would be illegal. That is because there's been no pre-market testing, there's been no safety evaluation before they were marketed, and now we have no routine surveillance for damaging effects of these devices. You only need to look across the ocean to what France has done to realize how backward we are in the United States today. The French government has an agency devoted to monitoring and testing devices for their radiation and to issuing advice to the public. They have concluded that 9 out of 10 phones, when tested next to the body, can exceed their safety guidelines, sometimes by as much as 4 to 6-fold. And because of that, in France, they have recalled millions of phones, and they are now issuing guidance that children should not be using phones generally. We have a lot to do to catch up here, and withdrawing this FDA report right now is an important step that should be taken immediately. Thank you.
When you mentioned detecting a brain tumor response in 50 animals, that yes, you can see perhaps 1 in 50, and we're trying to relate this to a large human population. But in order to reach statistical significance, you typically need, in 50 animals, a 10% increase in response. I'm not meaning this as a criticism, it's just an elaboration. But we increased the number of animals to 90 to try to provide a little more power to the study so that we could detect in the range of 5 or 6% as a statistically significant effect. But a 5 to 10% response would be a pandemic. If this, because of the billions of people worldwide who are using their cell phones. So what we really need to do is get that quantitative risk assessment to determine what is the risk at the levels that people are exposed to. Now, the FDA in their report said that the risk, if it exists, is extremely low. Well, I sort of question, how do they know the risk is low if they haven't done a quantitative risk assessment? That is the basis for determining risk. But even if the risk is low, that could have a very serious public health impact when 5 billion people worldwide or 300 million people in the US are cell phone users. You don't need a large risk to influence the health effects of millions and billions of users. Another thing that you mentioned that I also want to elaborate on is the concept of consensus. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people who do not follow the FDA's assessment of consensus. I was a panelist at the 2011 IARC review on radio frequency radiation. And at that time, we heard the presentations of the epidemiology studies from Sweden and the large interphone study, of which I might mention the US was not a participant, even though this was an international collaboration. Canada was a participant, many European countries were participant. But the panelists, and I believe there were somewhere between 25 and 30 panelists, it was approximately 85% of the panelists concurred that there was an effect going on among cell phone users that needed to be addressed, and came up with the concept of possible human carcinogen. And one of the reasons why it was possible and not probable, because when you have different studies showing an increase, many times that leads to a probable human carcinogen. But it was considered possible because the case control studies were considered to have potential bias. And this is mentioned in the FDA report, that there is potential selection and recall bias. But the Canadian group that was a participant in the interphone study evaluated whether recall or selection bias would have influenced the results. And they were able to demonstrate that for glioma, the bias had no influence. The risks were still twofold higher among the Canadian participation in the interphone study. So these are a couple of points I think are important to understand. In the FDA document, they totally misstate the findings from the NTP on the genetic toxicity of cell phone radio frequency radiation. For example, the report says there was, quote, no statistically significant increase in DNA damage in female rats or either mouse sex. And that's totally wrong. The NTP report shows the increase in DNA damage in the frontal cortex of male mice exposed to both GSM or CDMA modulated radio frequency radiation. They also make the claim that the increases in DNA damage in male rats was not statistically significant, when in fact the results showed significant increases in the frequency as well as in trends for the frontal cortex and hippocampus of male rats. So there are statements in this document which are just 180 degrees incorrect, and these need to be corrected. In addition, they downplay this concept of biological mechanistic plausibility. And that was the basis for actually the NTP study at the time, was that there was no mechanistic acceptance for how radio frequency radiation might cause an adverse health effect other than by heating. And in the FDA report, they even identify a large number of studies that show oxidative stress. There were at least 15 studies that provided evidence of genotoxicity. And oxidative stress is a characteristic of many human carcinogens, and it is known to lead to mutations, chromosomal translocation, genetic instability. So there is a biologically mechanistic plausibility for radio frequency radiation, which the FDA report just simply dismisses as non-existent. In addition, they only considered in vivo studies. And if you are trying to understand a mechanistic process, in vitro studies are extremely important. And there are numerous studies from in vitro, this would be outside of the animal, in vitro studies demonstrating oxidative stress and genetic toxicity. So the consequences, the radio frequency radiation may not by itself have enough energy to break bonds, but it, by inducing oxidative stress, can lead to DNA damage, and DNA damage is an early event that could lead to cancer.
It's important for people to understand something. You, Dr. Melnick, were one of the world's experts in this field, and where you were invited to participate by the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, to the only independent expert review we've ever had at that time in 2011 of all of the data assembled then. Subsequently, you and I and others have looked at the more recent information that has been accumulated. And I would ask, and Dr. Baldwin is aware of this as well, I would ask each of you to comment on your opinion on the following question. When it comes to understanding the kinds of evidence we have about cancer in humans, would you say at this point we have some evidence, we have compelling evidence? Put it in terms that people can understand, because people do not understand these terms, probable and possible carcinogen. How would you say it to the ordinary person in terms of what precautions should be taken now and why? I'll ask Dr. Melnick and then Dr. Baldwin.
Yeah. Well, I think the evidence is quite compelling. When I see multiple studies demonstrating an increased relative risk, that concerns me substantially. And I feel that the FDA message, by dismissing the entirety of the animal studies, the human studies, and mechanistic studies, which we haven't even discussed yet, is an irresponsible approach, because it implies that precautionary measures are not necessary. And if you ignore multiple studies showing a response in humans and animals, you are not protecting or promoting public health.
I would say the evidence is highly compelling. Also, we owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Melnick for his work. The concern that I have is that of all the potential carcinogens that are out there today, radio frequency radiation, cell phone use is so ubiquitous that it's up front and center in people's lives. And I can't help but think that it's a major player in promoting and potentially causing disease. The other thing that we didn't mention in today's discussion, dare we mention it, is the 5G phenomena. And the fact that those studies were done in 2011 with the technology that was present then, and now we're 2020 with higher doses of radio frequency. We didn't even mention that the phones on people's bodies are sending, receiving Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and now 5G.
If you're trying to predict harm in people, you want to pay attention to all of the experimental data. So in this particular case, what the National Toxicology Program scientists have published is evidence that in both rats and mice, there is DNA damage associated with exposure to cell phone radiation under these circumstances. And the FDA report gets that flat wrong when it says there is no such evidence.
I just want to make a comment about 5G, because the 5G issue came up a year ago for the Senate Commerce Committee. And at that time, Senator Blumenthal asked the FDA representative to share the evidence on 5G safety. And the FCC could not provide that evidence. They said the FDA had the evidence, but in essence, Blumenthal said, so in essence, you're telling me that we don't know anything about the safety of 5G. But there's a number of issues on 5G. So 5G does not penetrate the skin as deeply as the current cell phone radio frequency radiations. But the skin is a very important issue. For example, there are skin melanomas that exist probably in relationship to exposure to the sun. So that if we're now introducing another factor which influences this skin, will we see increases in melanoma incidence? We don't know. The eye would be unprotected from a non-penetrating or a minimally penetrating radiation. But another aspect is the skin is our major barrier to disease. And if we are exposing people, allowing exposure of people to something which can be skin damaging, might this lead to, I think, as you mentioned, Deborah, increase in infection rates on the skin, which can lead to maybe more viral transmission from people to people if the skin is damaged. You want to maintain that barrier because it is a protective barrier.
A very important point, because you can have acceleration of the growth of bacteria or viruses with exposure to 5G millimeter waves. That has been demonstrated. And I think that we would be foolish to ignore the possibility of these synergistic effects that can take place in the environment if 5G signals become more widely available, as they will have to be if the current marketing plans are to proceed. We have talked about only allowing millimeter wave frequency if it is wired to and through the premises. But that would not then be 5G. It would simply be faster speed through wired to and through the premises. And that would achieve the additional speed that emergency responders and banks may want. But there is no reason why the rest of the public should be subjected to this incredible increase in beam-forming radiation that has really never been evaluated for safety, and for which we have a number of legitimate concerns about what it will mean for public health and for the environment overall.
So I have a question just so I can understand this. If the 5G millimeter wave does not penetrate the skin, does that mean the new phones held next to the head, the radio frequency radiation is not penetrating into the skull?
Absolutely not, because all of the phones, in order to work for voice transmission, the phones for the foreseeable future are going to need 4G. Okay, that's number one. And all phones will have between 4 to 6 antennas. One of the antennas will be millimeter wave, perhaps 2, but others will be 4G. And in order to work, because of course you have to communicate with other devices that are already out there using this. So no, it does not mean that at all. And moreover, there's a recognition more recently in some very brilliant work that's been done on the skin, that the skin is not some kind of a inert barrier, but is in itself an immunological organ. And the best way I can think of to illustrate it is, think of how nice you feel when you're out in the sun, how you, even though this exposure is just to your surface, how the whole body feels well if you have some sunlight on you. It's a system response. It's not the skin responding. And indeed, skin does develop tumors with too much exposure to sunlight. So I think that it is certainly not the case that you're going to have less exposure, although they're going to claim that you will have less exposure.
If I can make it understandable for the public, I would say that we are all in great risk as we expose ourselves on a daily basis to the radio frequency soup that this world has become.
The FDA website was also updated. All of the pages were completely, everything that was on them was erased and new information was put on. So just as the report states that there's a scientific evidence that there is no proof, the websites that the American people, that people from all over the world look to get information, states that there is no consistent or credible scientific evidence of health problems. It also says, it has a title, No New Implications for 5G, where it talks about 5G, the FDA webpage, and basically downplays the science and states that there's no new information regarding impacts. And of course, the news is picking that up as meaning that the FDA says it's safe, which the FDA doesn't exactly say. Instead, they just dismiss the science. So I wonder if you could comment on the web page update.
It is shocking to see such a betrayal of the responsibility of the agency to protect public health. The fact that this report came out anonymously and then is used to justify scrubbing the FDA website, which previously gave people some information about how to reduce exposures. And now all of that information has been skewed to reflect the false statement that there is a scientific consensus that there are no problems with cell phone radiation. Today, the three of us are saying we do not agree. There is, in our view, a different scientific consensus. If you look at the views of the scientists Dr. Melnick mentioned, who are experts in the field, we believe that there is ample evidence for concern and steps should be taken to reduce exposures. There's no question that what the FDA has done here for its website and this issuing of this anonymous report is largely in response to litigation and challenges that they face now from a number of corners where citizens, and we have also filed petitions appealing the recent decisions of the FCC, which is based on what the Food and Drug Administration has advised it. And as we say here, this anonymous report must be retracted. It does not pass scientific review, and the FDA needs to reconvene and bring together independent experts to evaluate this situation, and cannot rely on this anonymous report. We are entitled to know who wrote it, who commissioned it, when was it done. That's all information that we're asking for under the Freedom of Information Act. And we hope there will soon be congressional demand for action here as well.
That 5G is going to use millimeter waves depending on the carrier, but actually, like in the United States, T-Mobile is using even lower frequencies, so different carriers are going to be using different frequencies.
Carrier wave.
We're going to be getting, it's not that we're going to be replacing the lower frequencies with just the higher ones, it's that we're going to be adding in 5G modulation and a variety of frequencies, including the higher frequencies on top of everything we have now. Because the phones, because we don't have 5G set up in a lot of places for at least the foreseeable future, the phones will go from, even if you're in a 5G area, they will have 5G, 4G, as Dr. Davis said. But then if you're in an area where there's not 5G, they'll be able to fully be used on 4G or even other technologies. So it's really like adding more into the mix.
The many concerns that we have about 5G have to do with the fact that this is millimeter frequency, so it's much faster, and it requires what's called beam forming technology, which means that the beam has to focus on the device when it's being used in order to send the signal from the device back to the antennas. We will need thousands more antennas, perhaps if it proceeds up to 1 million or more new antennas in the United States. They will be located closer to human beings than ever before. And we at Environmental Health Trust are now in the midst of a very active legal action to have the FCC withdraw and revise and review its approach here, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Dr. Baldwin. New devices will have multiple antennas capable of sending and receiving the 5G millimeter waves, 4G and 3G, which are in fact lower frequency. So the 5G is 5 billion cycles a second and above, and the 3G and 4G are between 900 million to 2.4 billion cycles a second. We know from the studies that we've talked about, that Dr. Melnick has played such an important role in clarifying, that these signals with lower frequencies are carcinogenic. And recent meeting in Israel discussed why we have grounds for concern that the 5G signals will also be found to be carcinogenic, as well as accelerating the growth of bacteria and viruses. So as you say, Dr. Baldwin, the effects could be far-reaching. And unfortunately, the United States today has almost no research underway on this topic, except for those studies that may be carried out now by the US military, which has been a major source of information in the past on this subject. So for those of you who want more information, please look at our website, ehtrust.org. Dr. Melnick, Dr. Baldwin, and I would be available for further technical questions. And Theodora Scarata is a world expert in what's going on around the world today, where countries and localities, states, and cities are all taking steps to reduce and control radiation because they want to prevent harm and not prove that it has already happened. Thank you.